With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say, no, you move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us here on Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. Welcome to the program this Tuesday evening. It is so good to be able to be with each and every one of you. I gotta say, amongst the self-quarantining, this is something that really helps give me a little bit of routine, something to hang on to, and even though I don't have direct human interaction with the audience, with the exception of maybe a few guys' comments, which, by the way, I encourage you to do, whether you're on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, there's always a way to comment. You can tweet me at Tactics Radio. I'd love a little audience interaction as well, but ultimately, you know, this is something that gives me a little bit of interaction with one another, and I think that's something that's really important for all of us in this time, where a lot of us are having to work from home, kind of distance ourselves from one another socially, and so it is something that really helps me, and I appreciate all of you listening, if nothing else, just for that, for selfish and personal reasons. It's something that I really enjoy being able to do every single day here on News Radio 1440. So as always, we are starting out the show this morning with this evening. Man, for a second I thought I was in morning radio again. I don't know what happened. Maybe it's because the sun's still out and that's throwing me off a little bit, but you know, daylight savings time. Anyway, we are starting off as we always do with our Alabama coronavirus update. Now, we'll go ahead and start as normal with our map from the Alabama Department of Public Health, which shows, which shows the location of new coronavirus cases. We are now up to 230 confirmed cases. That is a plus 34 since yesterday. So yesterday we were at 196. We have gained 34 new confirmed cases since then. The total tested has risen a little bit, which brings us down to about 10% as opposed to 11% of the people testing, which we had yesterday. So now roughly 10%, a little less than 10% of the people that are tested are actually being shown to have coronavirus. So that's not a very high rate, and in a lot of ways that is good news. Of course, it's never good news to find out that anybody has this thing, but the fact that we're only testing at 10% right now, and the fact that we've been able to hold at about 30 new cases per day ever since Thursday when we had that spike, has actually been pretty good, and we're roughly on par with where we were about 4 or 5 days ago, with having about 30-ish new cases every single day. Now, it's odd that it's flatlined. And by flatlined, I don't mean we're not getting any new cases, because of course going up 30 a day still means more people are being infected. But the fact that it's kind of plateaued in the sense that we're only getting about the same number of cases every single day, that's a pretty good sign. And it's possible that one of the reasons this is happening is A, because of the measures that we've taken in social distancing, shutting down a lot of public places, sort of just by our own desire to not get sick and to not be around and listening to what the officials are telling us and complying with those rules to the best of our ability, not through necessarily government force, but just because a lot of people want to do that. We've been able to achieve quite a bit in social distancing and flatlining that, and the weather also might be playing a factor. Like we've said, and I mentioned this yesterday with the fact that our temperatures are expected to be about 90, the fact that it's getting a lot more warm and a lot more humid outside than normal, it's starting to feel like living in Alabama again. The fact that that is happening is probably a pretty strong contributing factor to the reason that we're not seeing that exponential spike that I was predicting and that other experts were also predicting. So it looks as though that's something that may or may not have an effect. We're not sure. But the fact that we're only keeping it to about 30 new cases a day, that's actually really good compared to a lot of other cases and how they're dealing with it. Now, let's look specifically at our area here in the river region. Montgomery County is now the third highest county with cases of confirmed COVID-19. We are behind Jefferson County, which is by far and away in first place. Birmingham and that area has by far the most, and that's to be expected on one level because, they just got the most people. So by default, even if it were chosen completely at random, you would expect that Birmingham would be in the lead there, but they're in the lead by a significant amount. Like, it's a lot more prevalent in Birmingham than any other city in the state of Alabama and the Birmingham metropolitan area. And then you also have Tuscaloosa, which is ahead of us. That one is honestly a little strange because Birmingham, you can kind of see there's a lot of interstates that go through Birmingham. It's the biggest city in the state, which means the most business goes back and forth there. You have people traveling for business. You have more people going back and forth through it that are trying to get somewhere else, like to Atlanta. And Montgomery has that to a lesser extent. We're still a travel hub. Tuscaloosa's really not. And so I find it somewhat baffling that Tuscaloosa County has the second most cases according to the Alabama Department of Public Health. But, that's something that I could probably speculate on, but any speculation I would have would be a lot of guesswork and probably incorrect. So I'm just going to leave that as it is. Right now it's Jefferson County, Tuscaloosa County, Montgomery County. We're in third place with 9 cases now. But another thing that I think has had a significant impact on the fact that Alabama has been able to more or less flatline the curve, at least for the time being, it comes from the fact that we are doing a lot better about having several testing facilities up and working and being able to monitor the situation. So this is a new feature that the Alabama Department of Public Health's website just put up today. I want to say it was today. Maybe it was up yesterday and I just didn't notice it. But this is a tab that you can click down there on their coronavirus dashboard. And you can see that there are quite a few testing facilities in the Montgomery area. There's 4 in the Birmingham area. There's 1 in Tuscaloosa. There's 1 in Huntsville. And several around the Mobile and Bay area, the sort of the Baldwin County area. Now, looking at this map, there are a couple of blind spots here, and granted, those blind spots are going to be in places where there's less population, so A, that's to be expected because there's less resources there, and B, it's less of a problem just because you're going to have less people that want to get tested, but there are a couple of areas that, if you'll look there, are somewhat bare. They need to open one up, I would say ideally, in Enterprise, because Dothan is so far south that you'd be missing a lot of the people in the middle there. And I think that Troy is a little too close to Montgomery where there's already 3 facilities. So personally, if I were in charge of this, and thank goodness I'm not because I'm not a doctor or an expert in this, but in my personal opinion, if I were to add on a couple more testing facilities, I would think that the place that would be most ideal for that would be in Enterprise in the south, and then to cover us up on the northwestern front, I think that maybe Jasper or possibly Florence. Florence may be a little too close to the border, but Jasper I think would probably be a good location for another testing facility. And another one that's very surprising because Lee County, I believe, is the 4th highest county when it comes to testing positive for COVID-19. I'm really surprised that there is not one in Auburn. That was something that was quite astounding to me. Especially early on, Lee County, I think, was second only behind Jefferson County in confirmed cases of COVID-19. So I'm wondering if their testing facilities, they really need one there in Lee County. I'm surprised that they haven't done that. So a few reasons why this is important. First of all, rigorous testing is something that has been proven to be very effective. You may remember that the big difference in Italy, which now has a massive humanitarian crisis on its hands because their healthcare facilities, which, by the way, are single payer, so they are free, but they're clogged up and there are a whole bunch of people there to get tested, to get treated. They don't have nearly enough ICU beds. They don't have nearly enough ventilators. And so what you're seeing is problems stack up on top of one another, and there's really no way to relieve it because they didn't really do anything to curtail the spread of this thing. First of all, they kept their borders open until very recently. I mean, the crisis was basically already on top of their head and breathing down their neck by the time that they actually did close their borders to other countries. And so that was one thing that made a big difference with them. And another thing that was a real issue is that they didn't take this thing seriously until it was basically already on top of them. Now, in Italy's defense, they were only the second nation to have a problem this big with it. So I get that, they didn't think that they were going to turn into China, even though from a healthcare perspective, they kind of did, at least for a few weeks. And they're not really starting to see any relief yet. China is, but Italy isn't. But one thing that really shows the effectiveness of information and knowing who has this thing and who doesn't and who needs to social distance and that kind of thing is South Korea. Now, South Korea also does a whole bunch of other incredibly draconian, tyrannical things that would not be accepted by our Constitution, like tracking your GPS if you have COVID-19 or don't have COVID-19. So basically everybody. But if you have the Wuhan flu, they know where you are, they're tracking your GPS, and other people can see it. Now, I understand from an epidemic standpoint, that's a very useful tool to have. It's also completely unconstitutional. They had little restaurants sectioned off specifically for people that had already tested positive, and those that hadn't, they had this testing, and they got out in front of it, which, on that front, I do applaud South Korea for that, not necessarily the creepy Big Brother stuff. But on that front, the fact that they tested a lot and made people aware of whether they had it or not, that made a big difference for South Korea. And I think one of the reasons that maybe another contributing factor to that flatlining effect that we were talking about with only having about 30 new cases a day in Alabama may be because we have so many testing facilities open and operational and ready to go throughout the state. I still think there's some improvements to be made. I think that we need at least 3 more. One in Enterprise, one in Auburn, and then another one in either Jasper or Florence, somewhere in the northwestern corner of the state. But that's just my take on it. Anyway, I think that this kind of rigorous testing that South Korea did was very, very helpful in them being able to combat this thing, and though we can't do some of the other crazy 1984 kind of stuff that they were doing, I think that the testing would, if nothing else, make people more aware of it, and it would really help us in this. So let's look at how Alabama is comparing to the rest of the country. This is a map of the CDC put out, and we've actually looked at this once before. This is just the updated version of it that came out earlier today. So this is the CDC tracking how many cases of the Chinese flu going around here in the United States, and you will notice that Alabama is in the 100 to 500 mark, which we just talked about. We have 230 cases, so that map is up to date. Now, this particular map has us listed at yesterday's number, but that doesn't matter because it wouldn't move us into a second bracket. So you can see that there are several states around us with more that are in the 1,000 to 5,000 bracket, like Georgia and Florida. And then you've also got some other states that are in worse shape than us: California, New York, Washington, some of the ones that have the most cases of the Wuhan flu. But ultimately, this means that Alabama is closer to the middle of the pack. Now, you may recall that the first time we looked at that map, if you've been watching all of our Alabama Corona updates, that when you looked at it initially, we went from having no cases at all, or at least no reported and confirmed cases at all, because that is a difference there. I believe that we probably had cases long before that. But we had 0 confirmed cases, and then went from that to being in the top 25, the top 50 percentile of the states in numbers of confirmed cases within just a few days. And that was just within a few days of us starting to test. Now, when we're doing testing on a much wider scale, and we've already administered over 2,000 of these tests, we're dropped back down to about 28th. So what we are doing is working. There is some good news on this front. And another thing that is very encouraging, and this is, again, a national statistic, not one specific to Alabama, which gives us some good insight into being able to compare it. This is a total look at the graph based on day of how many confirmed cases the CDC has been tracking, and you will notice that we are on the upward trajectory of that spike. And it looks very similar, not identical, but very similar to some of the spikes that we've seen in other countries, including Italy, including China, South Korea to a lesser extent, but still similar to that. So what's important to understand about that, if you're looking at that exponential spike, we're going from about 33,000 to about 44,000 as of yesterday. Now that is a 33% increase. That is, pun intended, nothing to sneeze at. That's not something to take lightly. The fact that we're seeing a 33% increase in a single day, that is dramatic. But at the same time, yesterday we went from 24,500 to 33,000. That was the rate 2 days ago to yesterday, which is a 37% increase. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but 33, significantly less than 37. So our rate actually went down. The rate of new cases that we were having actually went down from yesterday to today than they did from yesterday to the day before, which means we're on the right path. It means that what we're doing is working. And so what we're seeing in all this is that even though we're starting to see something that somewhat resembles that exponential spike that we were seeing in other countries, it's not happening at the rate that we originally projected that it would, which is very, very good news. It means maybe we caught this thing in time, we were able to make the right adjustments and to be able to do what we needed to do. And by the way, I would like to note that, and it remains to be seen because there were some definite failings on the part of Alabama state government on this originally, but you'll notice that I talked about yesterday there was a 33% spike. That's significantly less than the 17% spike that Alabama experienced yesterday. So we are growing in cases at a significantly smaller, about half the rate that the rest of the country is. Now, again, that might be because of the weather. That could be because of a number of different reasons. And, you know, we'll see about that. It's a lot different than measuring a nation like in Europe, where their countries are roughly the size of our state. We have a much wider variety of climates within the United States of America. And so comparing state to state is really a more apt comparison. So maybe what we're seeing here is the effect of the weather. Maybe it was because cases started coming in later in Alabama than they did in other states. But the point is, what Alabama is doing right now, whether it's something that has nothing to do with the steps we're actually taking, like the climate or not, we're having less cases and we're growing at a smaller rate than the rest of the country. And we have not hit that exponential spike yet. Now, maybe we do. I don't know. Maybe we do wind up hitting that exponential spike where we're doubling or tripling the number of cases in a single day. But so far, we haven't even come close to that. And I hope that that is the case, that pattern will hold. So one thing that you're going to hear a lot, and I needed to do some research on this, so I'm going to help explain it to you, is the principle of the Arnott rate. Now, when I say Arnott, I'm talking about the letter R hyphen NAUGHT. In other words, R0 is what it's named after, the Arnott rate. And you may hear health professionals talk about this if you're watching cable news or watching any interviews with them or listening to them on News Radio 1440 with some of our other hosts. So basically what the Arnott rate is it looks at patients and people that actually have the infection and measures how many people they are spreading it to. So if you have one person spreading it to another person, then the disease is still growing, but growing at a rate that's pretty much manageable. If you have R0, that means that the average patient isn't spreading it to anybody. So you might occasionally have a patient that is spreading it to someone, but overall, the average person that has whatever infection that you're talking about, in our case, the Wuhan flu, that person isn't spreading it to anybody. You may still have some growth in cases because occasionally at a rate of under 50%, somebody will spread it, but by and large, this thing isn't spreading like wildfire. And what really gets scary is when you get the Arnott rate to roughly 2 per person or 2.5, which is roughly where China and Italy were with the COVID-19 infection. So that being said, our goal right now is to keep it under 1% under one person. If we can keep it under one person, then we're growing at such a rate that is low enough that our health facility is going to be able to handle it. They'll be able to adjust, and this thing is going to die out before it gets really, really bad. If we are transferring it at a rate of 2 or 2.5, that's at the levels that you become Italy or China. So what we're really trying to do is trying to prevent that, and it looks like so far that is what we are doing, because if you look at the R-naught rate, that is dependent upon percentages, and as I just reported, America's percentage right now from yesterday to today is only 33%. And Alabama's rate is much lower, almost half that rate, at 17%. So right now, what we are doing is working. The average person is not transferring this thing to another person. Occasionally, some people are, which is why you're seeing an increase in cases. But by and large, they're not. And that's really good, because what you're going to see with that, when people aren't transferring it to the next person, is that the next person that does get it is healing up. And even if they do wind up transferring it onto somebody, there's enough of a gap in there in the time that they get it and the time that they show symptoms and need medical care that the healthcare system can absorb that and be okay and not be overwhelmed. Granted, a one-person R-naught rate still is a pretty big strain on the health department and our healthcare services and our hospitals, our doctors, nurses, so on and so forth, but it's not an unmanageable one. And so what we're looking at right now is significantly below that, which is a really good sign. Now, it's very, very possible that we do wind up getting something similar to Italy or China, and I really pray that we don't, and I encourage you to also pray that we don't. But the point is, right now we are holding at a rate that is significantly less than that, and hopefully that is the way that it remains that's the way that it stays. We hold in that pattern, as it were. And if that happens, then this thing is going to die out before we get really, really bad. Now, I don't want to oversell this, and I don't want you to watch this broadcast and say, oh, Caleb says everything's fine. There's nothing to worry about. This thing's basically over. I can go out and do what I want. No, that's not what Caleb's saying. Hang on. Hold your horses there for a second. I don't want to oversell this, and I don't want people to watch this and think, oh, that means the worst is behind us and everything's good. I'm just saying that the initial numbers and the initial reports are very promising, and that's a really, really good thing. Maybe this winds up all hitting the fan tomorrow. I don't know. But the point is, what we are doing, distancing ourselves from one another, and some of the precautions we've taken, and again, maybe some other factors that we can't even account for yet, like the weather, is showing that this thing is probably not going to be as bad as we initially predicted, as I initially predicted. So take it with a grain of salt. Don't just go out and resume normal life like you would just yet, because we're still trying to gather data on this. But this is a really, really good sign at a time where we really need a good sign. So that's where I'll leave it for right now. What we're going to do is we're going to jump to a break, and we have a special treat for you. Jacob Summers, who is a personal trainer, actually joins the program in just a moment to discuss quarantining and how to stay fit, how to stay healthy when you're stuck at home and can't really do a whole lot. He has some tips on that. We'll go to him in just a second. We'll be back on Tactics.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. Today we actually have 2 readings from the SJW Bible dealing with the origins of life. The first one comes from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 1, verses 4 through 8. And it reads, Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I have appointed you a prophet to the nations. Though to be clear, that does not mean that you were a person before birth. At that point, you were merely a clump of cells that I didn't care about. Then I said, Alas, Lord God, behold, I do not know how to speak because I am a youth. But the Lord said to me, Do not say, I am a youth. Just speak from the heart, saying whatever you feel in the moment. And don't let anyone tell you you're wrong. Your youth is great because anyone over 30 is backward and out of touch anyway, and probably supports the patriarchy. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you from the bigoted old white men, declares the Lord. Our second reading of the day will come from Psalm 139, 13 through 16. For you formed my inward parts. You wove me in my mother's womb, even though I was not human until birth. I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made through billions of years of theistic evolution. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you, when I was made in secret, and skillfully wrought in the depths of the earth with my fish ancestors. Your eyes have seen my unformed gender-neutral substance, and in your iPad were written all the days that were ordained for me, that I might become an actual person when born, so that I could fulfill my goal of protesting fossil fuels. But if my gender-neutral parental unit had decided to exercise her right to end her pregnancy to stop that, I totally respect it. Wow, so inspirational. This has been another reading of the SJW Bible, and remember, the only truth that matters is your truth. And welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us here on Tactics. And we do actually have a treat for you. We have a special guest, Jacob Summers, who is a personal trainer at Crunch in Tuscaloosa. He's here to talk to us about how to stay fit with dealing with the, quarantine and the coronavirus and everything. And he has graciously agreed to be on the program with us. So welcome to the program, Jacob.
Hey, how's it going? You all right today?
Yeah, doing good. And, with everything that's going on, and I know I don't have to tell you about this, this is something that has been, I'm sure, on a lot of people's mind, and it's, such a big lifestyle change for so many people. It's something that really affects them. So first of all, I'd like to start out, and if you could just talk a little bit about your background, some of your credentials when it comes to being a personal fitness instructor, and how you kind of got into that.
Well, my pursuit of that happened back when I was in the military. I was in for 5 years in the Army, and towards the end of doing that, I decided that I wanted to take fitness, something that had helped transform my life and help me cope with a myriad of different life setbacks while I was in. I wanted to take that and use that to help people. But I knew that, not every person who's gone and trained themselves is, qualified to be a trainer or to be able to teach people on that subject matter. So I sought out a personal trainer certification through NASM, the National Academy of Sports Medicine. Every single time that I was on guard shift when I was in the Army, a 24-hour shift, I would study for it until I got my certification, got home, because I was stationed in Washington at the time, moved back here to Tuscaloosa where my family's from, and decided to try and get a career in that. It's been an interesting couple of years transitioning to being a full-time personal trainer, but that's where I'm at right now. And I work for a big gym, obviously, but I also do online training myself with my own business, Bars and Stripes Fitness, so that I can reach people across the country and here in my own town. So,
well, we certainly appreciate your service, and I know that my audience is really big on the military, especially when you consider I'm in Montgomery, which, as you know, is a big military town. So,
Gump Town, all right.
Yeah. We certainly appreciate that. And when it comes to a lot of people right now are in this sort of weird phase where they, with dealing with all this self-quarantine, they're really just not sure what to do. And I think that one thing that a lot of people probably, could help keep them busy and give them a sense of purpose if they don't have a lot to do, if they're working from home, that kind of thing. And another thing because we are transitioning to such a sedentary lifestyle, at least for the next couple of weeks until this whole thing blows over, they may kind of forget about or neglect their own personal fitness. So could you talk to us a little bit about maybe, first of all, a little bit of the psychological aspect and benefit of doing that, and also maybe some of the reasons that it would be really important to keep that in mind as they're going through this?
Oh, absolutely. That's actually a point that I've made multiple times with multiple gyms across the country being shut down, as we have states that go through various levels of quarantine, from, some businesses to non-essential businesses to all businesses. Not every gym in every state has been shut down. They may be working at limited capacity, like the one that I'm at right now. We're still open, but, we have restrictions in place to stay open.
Right.
But that's one thing that I've mentioned a lot, is that in going through all of this, I foresee a lot of people who are already working out, who may go to group fitness classes or work out with friends, or even go on their own. It's become part of their rhythm. So for people who are already doing it, it's part of their biological cycle at this point. They are mentally used to doing it. It's part of their routine and structure, but their body's actually used to the chemical processes that go into that. So obviously regulation of hormones, making sure that you are burning off the calories that you're eating, making sure that you are helping fight any type of mental health issue or anything else like that. There are people that go in order to battle depression or anxiety or sleep disorder. I know in some cases I have friends that I was in the military with that have forms of post-traumatic stress disorder, and going to work out is one way that they regulate that. So, it's absolutely essential to be able to stay in that rhythm. So for people who are already doing it, I know that they're seeking out live home workout videos with trainers or instructors they're used to. And then for people who haven't been working out, this is going to be kind of an additional setback in terms of, maybe you were already sedentary in your normal life and you weren't going to work out. Well, now you're stuck at home with no movement even going to your job.
Right.
And you're probably not eating as well as you could have while you're at home, which is not a judgment on anybody, but to say, I know I definitely have some zebra cakes and some Twinkies that were part of my emergency stash.
Sure,
So,
yeah. Well, and I think that's natural too, that when you talk about fitness, and I know we're primarily going to focus on that, but you said that you can speak a little bit on diet as well. The stuff that people are going to hoard, that's typically going to be food. And I'm in this camp too. I'm not trying to cast judgment on anybody else. The food that you can hoard, the food that is good for storing, that's stuff that typically is kind of loaded with preservatives, because that's what gives it that long shelf life. And so you're probably not getting nearly as many fresh fruits and vegetables and some of the things that you would normally get. And so could you kind of speak to that and some of the importance of trying to still maintain somewhat of a balanced diet, and also how much more important fitness can be if you're somebody in that scenario?
Oh, 110%. So obviously my only caveat with any nutrition, as I said, is that I can't make specific dietary recommendations to everybody, but obviously guidelines, basic rules, healthy eating practices, absolutely. So with that, I would say that you kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of most of the products people are going to buy have an additional amount of preservatives in them, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but obviously it's going to slow down your ability to absorb your food, or hinder your ability for your body to absorb your food correctly, because everybody's going out, including, healthy-minded individuals are obviously buying some non-perishable goods, and those include preservatives. So the biggest things that I would advocate for people to be able to combat that while they're at home is to make sure that they are buying things that have less preservatives in them and would be considered healthier foods. When I say that, take those, and then if you have the ability to freeze them or deep freeze them or put them into storage, do that. So one of the things that my girlfriend and I did was that we took meats that were obviously a part of our regular diet, and we just portioned them out and bagged them up, compartmentalized them, and froze them. And then sticking to things like whole wheat bread, obviously things where you can get away from eating simple sugars, carbs, preservatives, anything that's going to be something that your body either digests really quickly and then breaks down really quickly, which is sugar, starches, white carbs. Avoid those and try to still stick to your brown carbs. So even if you're getting minute rice, which has some preservatives in it, then still at least opt for the brown version. I always tell people the brown carbs, potatoes, brown rice, whole wheat bread, vegetables, all of those things are still things that can be bought in bulk and
they have a pretty good shelf life too. I mean, not maybe as long as some other things, but still that's a pretty good shelf life with things like wheat bread and brown rice.
Oh, absolutely. So the brown rice is in a lot of ways the same as the white rice. If you're getting the minute version, yes, some preservatives, but they store as long. But the whole wheat bread stores as long as, the white bread will. So if it's going to be the same shelf life, might as well opt for the healthier version while you're staying at home. So, and I don't know how familiar you are with brown carbs, but like I said, the basic concept is that the more complex the carb, the longer it's going to take your body to digest it, meaning your body's staying in an anabolic state instead of going catabolic, and basically breaking it down, storing it, and then your body's on to hibernation mode until your next meal. So,
all right. So one thing that I wanted to ask, and this is kind of to a degree where I am too, which is part of the reason that I'm so curious about it. What would you recommend? Are there any workouts that you would recommend for somebody that's stuck in their house, doesn't have a whole lot of room, or maybe can't, doesn't have any, a P90X DVD or something like that that they can work on? Like, could you recommend just some simple moves, something that everybody would be able to do with limited space?
Oh, absolutely. And without trying to plug too hard, I will say that is one thing that like I told you, I've been doing online through YouTube and through, I don't know if you've heard of Twitch or not, but
we're actually streaming on Twitch right now. So.
Oh, all right. Well, cool. I knew. All right.
Yeah.
So I wasn't sure which software was going where. So, all right. So
yeah.
Bars and Stripes Fitness on Twitch. That's how I stream it. I know multiple other people who are, but we're sticking to that concept we talked about. I've got my notebook right here. My handy bodyweight workouts, and they can be as simple as what everybody knows. If you have no other ability to make this any simpler or to try and create your workouts more, like you said, not everybody has that background. I break it into starting with basically 3 or 5 warm-up stretches. I borrow those from the Army Physical Readiness Manual, and they're simple things like bending and reaching, windmills, rowers, doing prone rows, doing things like that, at a 4-count pace for about 5 reps before going into a simplified version of the workout that I've been putting out, which is, I don't know if everybody knows what EMOMs are, every minute on the minute. It's a simple way, if you're at home, to set a watch and, minute 1, you do 10 or 15 reps of something. Minute 2, you do 10 or 15 reps of the next exercise. The way I've been doing it is basically sticking to 3 exercises. You do that round 3 times, and then we move on to the second circuit, do the same thing, and you're done. So for upper body day, you're asking for specific recommendations.
Right.
Our circuit number 1 is push-ups, which anybody can do, and you can do those on your knees if you need to modify them due to inability to perform a full push-up at first. Chair dips, which are basically where you're just going to keep the chair behind you and extend your elbows backwards, lowering your glutes to the ground. Plank up downs, which is a plank position where you're literally just going down to your elbows and then back up to your hands.
Mm-hmm.
And then circuit 2 is shoulder taps, which is basically planks where you're tapping either shoulder before putting your hands back down. And then we actually modified it and made it so that if you didn't have weights at home, you could take something as simple as a milk jug, string a hand towel through the handle, and use that to perform curls and tricep extensions. So, yeah.
Well, that's good, because that means some of your recommendations were things that I was already doing. So I'm at least somewhat on the right track there, I guess.
Oh, yeah. And I know not everybody has access to, the online videos, but I will say some of the best things you can do is keep it simple. Look up home body weight exercises, and they're going to be things like push-ups, dips. They're not going to be complicated. Glute bridges, planks. You can even do, on our leg day, we do rear lunges and squats. Basically just make it so you choose between 3 and 5, do those for a couple rounds. And if you still feel like you need more, go to another circuit and do 3 or 5 more exercises for a couple rounds. I think you'll find that in about 15 to 20 minutes, you'll get a good workout. I'm a power lifter, and when I ran people through the lower body workout yesterday, my quads were feeling it afterwards. So,
well, and that's the thing too, because one of the reasons that I wanted to have an expert on here to talk about this as well was because I know that being, what's the best way to put this? Not necessarily lazy, but not getting around to doing some of this stuff, it can have some really negative side effects. And for somebody like me who has a risk factor, because I'm a cancer patient, about 2 years ago when I was going through my last round of chemo, without going into way too much detail, cancer patients are already at a high risk for blood clots, and I actually had a PE blood clot, 4 of them in my lungs, and that wound up being a really big hassle. I wound up having to be on blood thinners for 6 months, and a lot of that had to do with just moving to a sedentary lifestyle where I was just not doing a lot because I was on chemo. I felt awful, and I didn't know that something as simple as just getting out and walking around for a half hour or something like that would have been something. And these are probably a lot of the same people that right now are having to self-quarantine even more than the regular person because they're at a high risk. And so I think that that's something that can be really, really helpful. As much as we want people to be safe and to, worry about their health in the sense that they quarantine themselves, you don't also want to neglect the other side of health, which is just keeping your body in good shape as well.
Oh, I completely agree, because there's already the tendency, and I joke about this amongst my other fitness-minded friends, but there's already the tendency that even without a quarantine, if you don't go to the gym, people say they'll work out at home, but that garage gym will collect dust. Well, right now we have to not only fight that mentality, but fight more. We need to be making sure that while we're at home, we are doubling down on it. It doesn't mean you have to go master every Jillian Michaels video in one day, but at the same time, get up. I mean, the American Heart Association and multiple other health associations basically say that if you get up and move 30 minutes a day, it's better than nothing. Like, obviously, the more advanced your workout gets, the better. It's better for your system. But getting up and moving for 30 minutes a day, whether it's playing catch with your kids, getting out, taking a jog, or something that's specifically like an exercise routine that intentionally focuses on different muscle groups to make sure you're not, working your upper body but missing your legs. Obviously that's the end goal, but moving 30 minutes a day at all is a wonderful thing. So it's going to help out with, obviously, it also helps fight immunodeficiency issues. So.
Right. And that's another thing too. Like we don't want people to neglect that side of their health. And one of the reasons that I wanted to bring somebody on and wanted to talk about this is I'm not suggesting that, even though this would be great if a whole bunch of people decided that they were really going to take working out seriously since they have more free time on their hands. I mean, that'd be a great thing to do if you can, but just for the people that, they might be sitting there watching Netflix like, well, I can't go out, so that's a good excuse for me to not go to the gym or to not go to the park and walk around. You still need to integrate that into your lifestyle for sure.
Oh, I completely agree. You really need to make sure that you're integrating that movement in, both for all the obvious reasons that we already have, which is, continue to be able to move your body so you can stay alive longer for your loved ones. Also, first off, I'm glad you're still with us. As far as the cancer thing goes, I meant to say that already, sorry. But I have a lot of friends that have gone through cancer, are either in remission or, they're in the process of it. But other than the basic reasons of, not developing any cardiovascular disease issues, overweight, obesity, anything else like that, that would prevent you from being able to continue to enjoy your life with your loved ones. Now we've got the additional problem of, if your immune system gets compromised because you're staying at home and eating unhealthy and not moving, well, then now, you make that trip to Walmart to go grab that toilet paper, you might have a compromised immune system. So
right, and if you get into a fight over the toilet paper, you want to be able to beat up the other guy. So I'm kidding. I'm not advocating violence.
Thinking Zombieland scenarios right now.
Yeah. Please don't pull me off of YouTube. So anyway, all right, Jacob. Well, do you have any parting thoughts before we wrap this up? Anything you want the audience to know?
Honestly, I would just say, going back to the workout that I was running you through, I do honestly encourage that every minute on the minutes structure for right now, just because for one very specific reason. You mentioned that, levels of inactivity might make it harder for some people to adjust into this, to begin to prioritize it. And by doing that, with that every minute on the minute, if you do your 10 push-ups, and you still got 50 seconds left in the minute, that's 50 seconds to rest, meaning you can take it at your own pace. You can also decide how many reps you want to do at first. Maybe you can only do 5 to 8. Okay, well, then after you've done the workout a couple times, maybe you can scale it up to your abilities. But that allows people who are very beginner people to get into it, have adequate rest times, stop and start when they need to, and then to progress as they need to. Progressive overload being a key fundamental of physical fitness. So I would honestly just say, eat right, stock up smart. Just because you have options or limited options for how much we'll store for a long time, obviously still make healthy decisions with those brown carbs, those complex carbs. Still stick in the regular sources of meat, as long as you're not vegan or vegetarian. Not making fun of that. I'm just not.
Right. Just saying it's a consideration.
It's a consideration, but they're still making healthy choices, because there are still healthy choices for preserving food and keeping it on hand, and then getting up and moving 30 minutes a day, whether it's one of the type of workouts that I or my other, trainer friends do, or if it's getting up and exercising to a video or going on a walk in a park and playing catch with your kids. But get up and move for at least 30 minutes a day right now. So.
All right. So let's say that once this apocalypse ends, as it were, some people actually treat it like it is the apocalypse.
A lot of
but
people
once all of this ends and people start getting out, get moving again, get back to work, that sort of thing, do start getting back in a daily routine. If they did want to seek you out or interested in their own personal fitness, if they're in the Tuscaloosa area, or even if they just would want to get in contact with somebody in their area, how would they do that? Do you have any contact information or anything that they could get in touch with you with?
So do I have a bat signal? Yes, I do. So
Excellent.
Basically, you can go to barsandstripesfitness.com. That's just bars and stripes, fitness.com. We're also on Facebook under that same name, Instagram, Twitch, basically any social media form, including TikTok. I started branching out with that recently. But pretty much any social media form you can find, you can go to Bars and Stripes Fitness, or you can email train@barsandstripesfitness.com. And we can either help you out in person, help with online programming, or we can direct you the way of other trainers who are in your area, because I actually do have a list of affiliates and trusted trainers in other states that I've been working on continuing to build over time. So I've got at least people in Kansas, Florida, all around the country right now, including Washington State, which is under lockdown right now. So if you need help, we can find somebody in person, or we can help you through online programming. So.
All right. Thank you very much, Jacob Summer, as personal fitness trainer. Is that your official title, personal fitness trainer? How does that work?
Personal trainer or fitness trainer, either one. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us. You have a good one.
Thank you so much. You too.
All right. Once again, that's Jacob Summers, a personal fitness trainer who was gracious enough to join us for this, and we'll be back in just a minute.
Hey everybody, headed south on I-65, just south of Clanton. And as you can probably tell by the view of the background here, it's raining, and it's raining pretty heavily. And it's something that I've always found very annoying, trying to drive in the rain. It's always something that's kind of a pain for me. Of course, it hurts your visibility, and it's annoying when you have to make a pit stop to head and get some gas or get something to eat. But you know, the funny thing about rain is that I think a lot of the ways in which we view it comes down to a matter of perspective. There's a great country song called "Where I Come From, Rain is a Good Thing." And I wouldn't say that it's necessarily my favorite, but it does point out a really important lesson about perspective. Because when you look at the scripture, it's very often that people will pray for rain, that they desire rain because they saw rain as something that is good for the crops, it increased the amount of food that was around, and the point of that country song is kind of the same thing. That when you're looking out in the country, people see rain as a good thing because it makes the crops grow, it's something that refreshes the earth. And another thing that you can view from the scripture is that the original rain that came, of course, in the flood of Noah was something that was very powerful and destructive and destroyed all of humanity. And yet, rain is also the way that God chooses to bless the earth by giving increase. And I really think that it goes down to this analogy, which I heard a long time ago, which is happiness, if it had a physical shape, there was a physical form or a thing that you could use to describe happiness, that shape would have to be in the form of glass. Now, the interesting thing about glass is you can't always see it. If it's clear and it's clean, it's very easy to miss that it's there. But just like happiness, all you have to do is shift your perspective just a little bit, and you will realize that the thing that you had been looking for this whole time was actually there all along. I think that's what the Bible means by being content and finding joy. And this is something that is a frequent theme of Paul's writings, which is very appropriate considering several of his writings, and the ones specifically where he talks about, I'm thinking of the book of Philippians, for example, are pieces of scripture that he penned while being persecuted for his belief. And so the difference in joy and contentment and happiness is a good thing. I'm not against happiness. I don't want anyone to think that. But the reason that I say joy is actually deeper, joy is the thing that is actually like glass. So I think that quote that I gave a second ago needs modification just a little bit. Because happiness can come and go. It's a feeling, it's an emotion. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you have no control over it. Finding joy in the Lord is a completely different concept. Because it is something that is there regardless of your circumstances, regardless of how you're personally feeling that day. It's not something that is subject to the conditions of life. It's something that you make a choice and a decision that you are consciously choosing to be joyous. And the way that a Christian finds that joy, the way that the Bible describes that, is that it only comes through knowledge of salvation in eternity. Knowing that there is a all-powerful God that, despite having enough power to create the entire universe, loves us and cares enough for us to sacrifice his only son. The fact that there is a God that thought enough of us to give up his only beloved son so that he might be able to again have communion with us and to save us from the condition of our own sin. I mean, how can you know that and believe that and be anything but joyful?
And welcome back, everybody. Thanks so much for being with us here on Tactics. And we also would like to say one last thank you to Jacob Summers of Bars and Stripes, which you can follow him. Actually, I'm following him now on Twitter. I checked him out during the break at Bars and Stripes. So check that out if you do want more fitness tips. And, of course, be sure to remember while you're in quarantine to stay fit, because you, of course, want to worry about your health, staying away from everybody and trying to keep yourself from getting infected. But if your body's already broken down and not, operating in the way that it needs to, that's going to cause health problems. And this is a time where you really don't need other health problems because the healthcare system could very well get overwhelmed. So thank you so much to him for doing that for us. And be sure to remember your personal fitness while you're going through the self-quarantine and all of that that's going on. Now, if there was ever a summary of the Democrat political strategy in a single sentence, it comes from Rahm Emanuel, who is the former chief of staff of President Obama. He's not currently the mayor of Chicago, if I'm not mistaken. I think somebody else has actually taken up the mayor of Chicago, but he was mayor of Chicago for a long time as well. And Rahm Emanuel said, which has become sort of a colloquialism, even though people don't really remember where it comes from, is never let a good crisis go to waste. And sort of reflecting that same sentiment, the majority whip for the Democrats the other day said that when it comes to this bill that they're putting forward, the legislation that they're trying to put in place as part of the Corona stimulus package, he said that we have a tremendous opportunity, and this is a paraphrase, it's not an exact quote, but this is basically what he said. He said, we have a tremendous opportunity to reshape things as we see fit. And this is something that really is a problem that the Democrats have been using this crisis as leverage to be able to score political points. And there's an awful lot of things, really in every bill that has been proposed, Republican or Democrat, that I really haven't liked. But it is just absolutely horrendous, some of the things that they are doing right now. For example, when it comes to the Green New Deal, they're actually implementing and put in their proposal that Nancy Pelosi proposed today, they're putting in that proposal the enforcement of the Green New Deal, which is ridiculous on a number of levels because, for starters, the Green New Deal has not been passed. And not only did it not pass, not a single senator, Republican or Democrat, voted in favor of it. It didn't matter how far left the Democrat was. Bernie Sanders wouldn't even vote for this thing. That's how far left it was, how much money it was going to cost. And yet they're trying to slip in there as a part of federal law enforcement of the Green New Deal. Well, A, it's kind of hard to enforce a law that hasn't been passed, but if you were going to enforce a law that has not been passed by Congress, the only way that you could think to do that would be if you had the law enforcement agencies go out and enforce the law even though the law isn't actually on the books, which A, is illegal, and B, if you were going to accomplish that in the federal perspective, basically this would be a wink and a nod to people like the EPA saying, yeah, you know what? Go ahead and enforce all those rules that we put in the Green New Deal, even though this isn't actually a part of the law that we're coming up with. And I had a friend that he he asked a good question the other day. It's not a silly question by all means. I'm not making fun of him for asking it or anything like that because it's a good question. But a student of politics understands the answer to it, which is this bill that they are proposing is well over 1,000 pages long. And the person that was asking this was just saying, how did they come up with something that's 1,400 pages long? We haven't even known about the coronavirus for very long. How is it that they got this thing to be so long? How did they even write that much law in such a short amount of time? And the answer, if you understand history, is actually quite simple. Did you know that the Patriot Act was actually written in like 92 and 93? And then it was proposed in 1994? But you may be saying, wait a second, the Patriot Act, isn't that where the NSA was phone tapping everybody and keeping all of our records and keeping all of our data and recording all of our phone conversations and spying on average citizens? And that was something that was done in the wake of 9/11? Yes, it was passed in the wake of 9/11. It was not written in the wake of 9/11. It was written almost an entire decade before 9/11 ever took place in 2001. You see, the Patriot Act had been something that bureaucrats in Washington and insiders that are in the Beltway, they'd been wanting all that stuff for years. The reason that it never passed is because they never had a crisis that was big enough to justify it to the American people. And by the way, this is not a partisan rant that I'm going on. Remember that the Patriot Act was overwhelmingly supported by and sort of talked up, I guess is the best way to say it, by Republicans. They were the ones that were leading the charge on this. So it's not just the Democrats that live by this never let a good crisis go to waste thing. They certainly make more use of crises than the Democrats do. Or sorry, than the Republicans do, but Democrats are not the only ones that use this. And so what you have going on now is the Democrats in the House and the Senate, primarily in the House, but also in the Senate, that are kind of falling in line, including our own Senator Doug Jones of Alabama, who has voted in lockstep with the Democrats on this stuff, is a laundry list of things that they wanted to pass and have wanted to pass for a really long time, but couldn't figure out a way to do it. And so what they're doing now is they're holding hostage the stimulus package, which, by the way, a lot of which I don't even agree with, but they politically believe that they're going to be able to score points on their opponents if they hold back on this thing, and if they say, see, the Republicans aren't going to pass it, and what we're doing is we're offering a bigger stimulus package that is more generous, despite the fact that a lot of the things in their package is basically just a dream list that has nothing to do with the stimulus. I already talked about the Green New Deal. That was one thing. Another thing that you may not be aware of, and this thing is incredibly dangerous, Forbes reported this earlier, that included in this legislation, which we're still kind of trying to parse through just to find all the stuff that's in it because of how big and lengthy it is it creates a digital dollar. Now, granted, this isn't a major step in one direction or the other because we've kind of already had a digital dollar to a degree. And so because of that, it's not like a massive step in one particular direction, but it gives the Fed license and legal standing to say that they're just going to, instead of printing physical dollars, paper money in other words, that we're just going to create digital money. Now, like I said, the Fed kind of already did that with quantitative easing 1 and 2, but if they are allowed to do this, this does something that completely undermines our system. It completely undermines our financial system, and remember that many of the major crashes, both in America and in other places as well, happened when we started creating fake money. In other words, money that was not backed up by anything. Now, there's a whole thing, I could go on a 30-minute rant about the gold standard and the silver standard and how we were taken off of that and so on and so forth. But even ignoring that, you could look at the crash called Black Tuesday that caused the Great Depression. Because you may remember that what happened there is a whole bunch of people had worthless banknotes that weren't backed up by anything in the bank's actual safes. And then when they went to all cash those in after the big stock market crash, then the economic system crawled to slowed to a crawl. And so what we had done is we had created a fake currency that wasn't backed up by anything of actual value. The same thing could happen here. And if the Fed just has license to print as much as it wants, and they don't even have to physically print a dollar, all they have to do is say, okay, here's a digital dollar and that money exists now. That creates all kinds of other problems. Another thing that they are doing in this stimulus package, which again has nothing to do with helping people with the coronavirus, is unions. And not even normal unions, specifically government unions, and expanding their negotiating power. Now, there's a whole other reason why government unions shouldn't even exist. I mean, even Woodrow Wilson, who was largely elected by unions and their efforts to get him in the White House, said you can't have government unions because government workers would essentially just threaten to vote out their bosses. Like, a government shouldn't be able to have a union if you're a government worker, because their direct bargaining doesn't work with them the way that it does with a private business. And he was right on that, by the way. One of the very few times you'll hear me actually agree with something Woodrow Wilson said. But when it comes specifically to government unions, that means that this also has nothing to do with what's going on with the Wuhan flu. Because they're all still getting paid. We're not in a government shutdown right now. And so I fail to see how this would in any way help anybody that is dealing with the Wuhan flu. Like, there are government workers, and by the way, I'm friends with several of them. And I'm not just talking about state level workers, even though I have friends that work there too. I'm talking about specifically some of my buddies that work for the federal government. And they're working right now. Now, they may be working from home, or they may be working in shifts where they're coming in and half the office is at home and half isn't because they're trying to maintain the social distancing protocol. But government employees are still going to work. And so it doesn't make any sense to expand the bargaining power of federal government unions at this time. Government employees aren't really being affected by this in the same way that private employees are. I'm not saying that they're not experiencing some side effects, but the idea that this would be something that would be instrumental to helping people affected by this pandemic is simply not true. Another one that they've done, and there's like 30 of these, I'm just going to go through a couple of them, is automatic voter registration required for the states whenever somebody gets a driver's license. Well, there's a number of reasons why that's a horrible idea. First of all, there are states like New York, like California, that offer driver's licenses to people who are not citizens. And this would basically be giving a license to those people to be entered into the federal voting registry and be able to vote in elections. That's a horrible idea. By the way, the federal voting registry isn't something that exists. I was just talking about the registries of the states, and then those votes would be counted at the federal level. I wanted to clarify on that because I know I was going to have a mob of angry commenters on YouTube talking about there's no such thing as the federal voting registry. I was talking about the results, not that there's an actual list of federal voters. I understand that. But anyway, so that's another thing that it would be the Democrats not only completely ignoring the 10th Amendment and going straight over their head and jumping to the states mandating who they register to vote and who they don't register to vote, but they would also be registering anybody that gets a driver's license, which some states don't want to do. Now, granted, it's usually not a lot more difficult than getting a driver's license to be registered to vote. In fact, in our own state of Alabama, you basically just, when you do go to get your driver's license, they say, hey, you want to register to vote? Sure. That's about as complicated as it is, honestly. So I don't see that this is something that is necessarily something that is needed. There's a whole bunch of people that want to vote but didn't because they didn't register when they got their driver's license. I don't see that as being a big deal. But again, this is just something that has been a Democrat talking point for a long time. They're trying to slip in there that has nothing to do with the COVID-19 pandemic. And another thing, well, okay, I got a video interrupted notification. I was afraid. I think we're still on the air. It looks like we are. Anyway, And another thing that is a really big issue here that I've seen a lot of Democrats complaining about this, and that they've had criticisms of the Republican versions of this bill. They said, well, this is just a whole bunch of corporate bailouts for a lot of Donald Trump's buddies, which is dumb on a number of reasons, because there's a few reasons that A, this isn't a bailout, and B, even if it were a bailout, the Democrats didn't exclude that stuff from their version of the bill. It's still in there. So if this is a bad thing, then why aren't they equally mad at Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and the other Democrats, because their bill also includes that? If that was something that was so evil, and I've seen Democrats, even Democrats that are voting in favor of this bill, that includes this, trying to paint this as though it's a bad thing, saying that that ultimately that's the reason that the Republican version of this bill was bad. Look, it's one thing if you say it didn't include things that we want, or it didn't include things that we feel is necessary for this bill to include, but don't just straight up lie about it and say that, this thing was just filled with a bunch of corporate bailouts, and then say, but we're okay with the corporate bailouts when we do it. Anyway, this isn't technically a bailout, and here's why. When you saw a bailout beforehand, when you're talking about the banks or the auto industry, when you were talking about a bailout then, it was a bailout because they had made dumb business decisions. And as a result of their own stupid business decisions, the government mandated they were too big to fail and it was going to cost too much to the country. And so here's some money to take from us. And we'll just kind of we'll kind of float that to you to keep your business going. That's very different than, okay, the government is seeing that there is a threat on the horizon in the form of this virus, and we're mandating that you close down, but since we're the ones that caused you to lose this business as a precaution of this virus, which is nobody's fault, we're going to float you a 0% interest loan to just keep the economy from tanking or a bunch of businesses going under. The businesses didn't make the virus. The businesses did not create the scenario in which they needed the money, like it did with the auto bailout or the bank bailout. And by the way, the banks were actually being bailed out completely independent of the stimulus package by the Fed, but that's a story for another day. But what's going on now is they're trying to claim this is a bailout, but this lacks all of the normal problems that people had with the bailout. Remember, the Tea Party was created as a reaction to the bailouts. We're not in favor of crony capitalism or corporate welfare. That's a very bad thing. But this is not that, because this is something that was an act of God. It had nothing to do with the businesses making bad decisions. The businesses were, understandably expecting their doors to continue to be open and business to continue on as normal, and it didn't happen that way because of circumstances that were completely beyond their control, and because the government decided that it was best for everybody's safety, which is something that I agreed with, that the local and state governments decided that a lot of those businesses needed to close down. The federal government said, okay, what we'll do is we'll give you a small business loan, which, by the way, you are expected to pay back. It's not just a gimme that we're going to give to you, and you don't have to pay us interest. Just pay it back to us at some point when you get there. Now, here's the funny thing about this. Democrats don't seem to understand that the vast majority of Americans are employed by private corporations. And sometimes they're huge, and sometimes they're very small. But either way, if nobody's working and there's no money coming in, what do you think the first thing that they are going to get rid of is? It's probably going to be their payroll. Because if you're not, let's say you're a restaurant and you're just completely closed down, you're not even offering a takeout service. Well, if that's the case, and this is what you're doing right now, then what you would have to do is you would shut down your lights, you would shut down your gas bill, you would shut down all the things that normally would be running, and you can save a lot of money that way. But you know what's still running? If you have salaried employees, they're still expecting to get paid. And you may be wanting to, just to make sure that they remain on your payroll and don't go looking for another job, give at least something to your hourly workers as well. And then there's, of course, also workers' benefits and some of the other things that go along with that. And so the workers, your labor, is a continuing expense even when your business is shut down and not making money. So what's the first thing that you would have to look at as a company if you're afraid you're going to go under if you don't stop the bleeding? It would have to be your labor expense. And so when Democrats start talking about, well, it was just a big bailout to corporations, well, the purpose of it was to keep their employees going, to keep that money flowing to the average citizen. And maybe that citizen worked for AT&T or Verizon or Disney or one of the other giant companies, or maybe they worked at a little mom and pop place down the street. Didn't matter. Those people still rely on a company, on a business to provide money for them, and they still are going to have labor costs. And that's the reason for this thing that's being called a bailout, even though it's actually not a bailout. That's the difference in that and Chrysler or Chevy needing a bailout because they made a bunch of dumb decisions and they weren't able to make cars that suited the market and what the market was demanding at the time. That's a completely different scenario. And I'm not even saying I necessarily agree with the 0% interest loans. I'm just saying that is something that definitely does need to be considered. That is a big difference in what they're talking about and a bailout. And sort of along those same lines, let's go ahead and jump to the daily dose of stupid.
No, you messed it up. You're stupid.
And for today's daily dose of stupid, it's actually two stories. There's actually several stories that sort of fit under this umbrella, but I'm going to specifically deal with two examples here because the media's coverage of this during the Corona-19, the media's just been awful. And I know that they're awful all the time, but there is an expectation with not just the media, but with everybody in some kind of massive crisis like this, like thinking about some of the recent hurricanes, Hurricane Harvey, for example, that people just came together and they saw that their neighbors were in need and they just got it done. There is an expectation, and the media never does this, unfortunately, but there is an expectation in a crisis like this for us all to come together, put aside our differences, at least for a little while until the storm has passed, and maybe then we start talking about politics. The media is still trying to score political points in the middle of this whole thing, and these two stories especially are a perfect little synopsis of why half the nation looks at the mainstream media and says, you guys are fake news. You can't be trusted. When you guys say something, we at the very least take it with a grain of salt or might even just disregard it entirely just because you're saying it. Now, I don't think that that's necessarily the right attitude to have about it, but because of stories like this, you understand why people have that level of frustration with the media because they are intentionally misleading people with their stories. The first example of this is that the New York Times the other day changed its headline 3 different times to cover for the Democrats when it came to the story we were just talking about, trying to put together a stimulus package to aid people during the Corona shutdown. So this is you can see here that they changed their headline 3 different times. You can look at this. The first one there, Democrats block action on $1.8 trillion stimulus. And then you'll see that turned into Democrats block action on stimulus plan seeking worker protections. Oh, okay. So the Democrats are blocking the plan, but they're only doing it to protect the workers. That's really what it is. And because the first headline didn't convey that enough, they decided to change it. And then apparently there were some people that had an issue with that one too, because they changed it a third time. Partisan divide, the threatens deal on rescue bill. I got too anxious there. I should have slowed down and read it properly. But you see the evolution that's taking place here, that originally it's just a very fact-based thing. Like, regardless of how you feel about the Democrats or Republicans, maybe you felt that the Republican $1.8 trillion stimulus wasn't enough. Okay, I think you're wrong, but we can have that discussion. That's just giving you the facts. Democrats block action on a $1.8 trillion stimulus. Doesn't say the Democrats were wrong for doing so. Just says that they were the ones that blocked it, which is true. Then, of course, the second one. Democrats block action on stimulus plan seeking worker protections. Oh, see, now what they're doing is they're trying to explain away them blocking it, and then eventually they just go to, oh, it wasn't the Democrats' fault at all. It's just partisan divide. It's just people can't agree on things. Now, here's the funny thing about all of this. There's technically not a single one of these headlines that are inaccurate, but you can see the evolution from one to the other where the news is constantly changing, even though it's the same story, and trying to explain away the Democrats or try to explain how the Republicans are really the ones to blame and how they're really the ones that are evil. Now, you may remember that they did essentially the same thing, I believe it was last year. Yeah, it would have been last year when they were covering Trump's speech after the Texas and Ohio shootings. Because originally, you'll remember that headline said, Trump urged unity versus racism, which regardless of whether you like the speech or not, regardless of whether you agreed with the speech or not, that's an accurate headline. And then they changed that headline later to assailing hate but not guns. In other words, they were upset that Trump didn't talk about let's get rid of guns or let's, get rid of the NRA or let's come up with some new gun control legislation. You see how even though each one of those headlines and each one of the headlines we just looked at are technically factual, you can see the transition from one where it's just, okay, let's just give the people the story. This is what happened, to let's give the people what happened, but let's also give it as much spin as we can to benefit our side. You see, that's the difference. And the news looks at that and goes like, well, we're not fake news. We didn't say anything that was untrue. Well, yeah, but you specifically tried to mislead people and give it a positive spin for one side or the other. That's fake news, or at least that's what a lot of people are considering fake news. Technically, my definition is a little different, but you understand why people get so frustrated with the media when this happens. And I think part of the reason that Democrats felt comfortable in just torpedoing this thing in order to offer a counter bill, which has a whole bunch of crap that has nothing to do with coronavirus in it whatsoever, is because they knew the media would do this for them. They knew that what was going to happen is, regardless of whether they were the ones that blocked the bill or not, the media was going to make it the Republicans' fault regardless. And we see this every time there is a government shutdown. You remember that back when President Obama was in office and the Republicans had control, the Republicans did not have control of the Senate, what happened is Ted Cruz and Rand Paul, on different occasions, but each one of them did this at different times for different reasons, caused, and I say that because it really takes both sides to cause a government shutdown. One member of the Senate can't do it, but they caused a government shutdown, and that's exactly how the media covered it. Ted Cruz shut down, or Rand Paul shut down, and they blamed the Republicans for that. But what they didn't do is when the reverse happened, and the Democrats were in charge of the Senate, and they're the ones that shut the government down, when the Democrats were not in charge of the Senate and they had the power of filibuster and they stopped the government bill from going through unless it included things in the budget that they wanted, then all of a sudden the Republicans are the ones that were causing the government shutdown because, well, they're the ones that are in control of the Senate. You see the double standard there? They're always trying to spin it in favor of the Democrats. Even if they're not technically lying, the bias is obvious. And that's what people really get frustrated with. And I think what this does, and this and also other examples of the New York Times doing this, it shows one thing that most of us have known for a very long time. The New York Times is not a journalistic organization. They are not a news outlet. They are not selling news. They're not selling facts. They are selling people bias confirmation. People want to be assured, people want to know that other people out there are thinking like they are and taking the story the way they're taking it. And that's what the New York Times is really selling people. With the constant changing of the headlines, it's almost like, we're getting a whole bunch of angry emails and calls about this headline. Maybe we should change it. And then they changed it, and they were still getting angry calls and emails from people on their side. And so they said, okay, we need to change it in some way to make it look like it's both parties' fault, because that's the only way we can justify this thing. But that's not the way a journalist would handle the situation. A journalist, and keep in mind, even though I'm not one, I did go to school and was trained as a journalist. What a journalist would do is say, sorry, that's the facts. You don't like it, don't read it. That's up to you, but I'm not changing my headline. That's what an actual journalistic organization that cared about accuracy in the news would have handled it. Oh, you were offended because it made the Democrats look bad? Sorry. That's what happened. And by the way, same thing if it made the Republicans look bad. There have been some things that you could use to make Donald Trump look bad when you just told the facts and the facts made him look bad. Oh, the facts made him look bad? Sorry, they're the facts. That's how a journalist handles it. The New York Times is not a group of journalists. They are a group of partisan Democrat hacks that carry the Democrats' water, and this proves it. All they are doing is selling a product to other Democrats that want to read in the New York Times that the New York Times agrees with them. That's the purpose of the New York Times. And sort of along those same lines, although not exactly the same, Axios, another far left-leaning organization, President Trump was talking about this old malaria drug that they are trying and having some success with treating patients that have COVID-19. So Trump did what he always did. I mean, this is just Trump's MO, so I don't know why people are surprised about this. Trump went on Twitter, and he also went on TV talking about how great it is and how it's the best. It's like the next thing that's going to wind up taking this thing out, and grossly overselling it. But that's what Trump has always done, even long before he was ever in politics. I mean, everything's the biggest, the brightest, the best. And so I get that it's annoying, but that's just what Trump does. He constantly oversells things and overstates things. Well, the media saw this as an opportunity to call him out on that and blame a whole bunch of stuff that has nothing to do with the president on him, because he didn't say anything that was factually inaccurate. He was a little overly optimistic about where it was going to lead, but he was saying they're doing some testing with this old drug that we used to use for malaria, and they're taking a look at it, and it tends to work pretty well. So what happened with that is there was a story that came out yesterday, and I'm not going to tell you the whole story until a little bit later to help you understand how dishonest this is. This is a headline from Axios, and you can see there, so you see the picture there, and the headline is "Man Dies with Self-Medicating with Chloroquine Phosphate." Now, I believe this headline was actually altered as well, because if I'm not mistaken, the original headline was self-medicating with COVID-19 drug that the president praised or something like that. Because if I'm not mistaken, I went back to grab the screen of this, and the headline had changed on this one as well. I can't prove that one, so don't hold me to that, but I'm pretty sure this headline also by Axios was changed. But here was the whole article that I did get originally when I read it. A man has died, and his wife is under critical care after the couple, both in their 60s, ingested chloroquine phosphate, a additive commonly used, which is also one of the anti-malaria drugs that President Trump has mentioned in recent days, according to Banner Health, the hospital system treated in both patients. People who attempted to self-medicate risk serious side effects or death, and are messaging about chloroquine and its related hydrochloroquine should emphasize that these drugs have not been approved to prevent or treat the new coronavirus. So looking at that makes it look really bad. It makes it sound like, okay, the president goes on TV pushing this new, well, not new drug, but this drug that has been used for malaria for decades, that he's saying that they've had some success treating people with COVID-19, and all of a sudden this guy sees that and reacts to it by taking this stuff and almost dies, dies, and his wife is in critical condition after ingesting the stuff that the president recommended that people take, which, first of all, he did not recommend that people take it themselves. He was saying that doctors are looking into this. That is a completely different thing. He didn't say, and everybody should take this right now, ingest as much of it as humanly possible. That's not what President Trump said. He said that doctors are having some success with it, and it looks like this may be the answer that we were looking for, which is true. You know, maybe it winds up being a big bust. Maybe it winds up being the silver bullet we were looking for. I tend to think the answer is going to be somewhere in the middle, but the point is, what President Trump was saying was factually accurate. He didn't say that people should be taking this on themselves. And here's another thing. They kind of forgot to mention that the man and his wife mentioned in this story did not take pills of this particular drug. What they did is they drank fish tank cleaner that had this as one of the ingredients. That's a pretty big detail to just kind of forget to include in your story. Because you just heard me read the entirety of the article, nowhere did it mention that. And you will also notice that if you look at the graphic of the headline, we can pull that back up right here, you'll notice that in the picture they included with the headline, they have a guy standing there with the drug in pill form, which would lead you to believe that this guy just self-medicated with pills that the president recommended. That is not true. Not a single pill was included in this story, yet that's the picture they chose to use for the headline. It's very obvious what they were trying to do is lay the blame for this guy's death at the president's feet and make it seem as though, well, that guy was just doing what the president told him to do. That would be like if back in the Obama administration, that President Obama was making a speech about something random and he said, and also the human body needs a lot of salt. And, you know, if you don't have salt, you'll die. Which is medically accurate, a correct statement to make. And I said, oh, I guess I need salt. So let me eat some laundry detergent because it has salt in it. Well, is that President Obama's fault? No, it's the idiot that drank detergent's fault. I can't believe people are trying. I mean, I can believe it. I shouldn't come to expect anything less from the media. But I mean, it's such a ridiculous stretch to say that President Trump should be blamed for this moron drinking fish tank cleaner. It's one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. But you have to hand it to the media. They do come up with some creative ways to try to blame Trump for things. Now, later, after people like myself on Twitter had called them out for not including that little detail that they just forgot, they did add another line underneath it that said, worth noting, gee, no kidding, worth noting, the malaria drug comes in tablet form, but the type that the couple used was in a toxic substance, not medication. Well, thanks for clearing that up. Still didn't change the picture, by the way. So anybody that was just looking through and seeing the headline, which is what most people do, would still think that this was taken in pill form. But it's just so hilarious that the media thinks that nobody's going to call them out in the age of the internet when people can look things up. But it's very clear looking at all the details of that, how they added those critical details of the story later and how they picked the picture that they did. They were clearly trying to skew the story in a way that made President Trump look bad, even though this idiot doing that, for all we know, he didn't even hear that from the president. He may have been reading reports just like the president did, just like I did, about how this drug is having some limited success on patients with COVID-19. And even if the president had been the reason he did that, President Trump didn't tell people to drink fish tank cleaner. I mean, to blame the president for that, or to blame anybody that was talking about that for this guy being a moron and drinking poison to try to save himself from coronavirus is just stupid. If anybody would be to blame for that, it would be him, not anybody else. People are accountable for their own actions. But it's just so disappointing because the media sees scoring political points as their job, and that's the reason why even in the midst of this crazy time where you would think that people would have enough sense to put some of those things aside and to come together for a little bit, Well, they see this as doing their job. It's their job to make the other side look bad, and that's the reason that they can, at least from a psychological standpoint, justify doing this even in the midst of something of this magnitude. Let's go ahead and go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
And Chaplain's Report, help if I turn my camera on. Chaplain's Report today comes from the book of Exodus, and I've been doing a lot of daily Bible reading, and I just recently finished the Pentateuch, which, if you know, the Pentateuch ends in Deuteronomy with Moses dying on the other side of Jordan, and then Joshua starting to lead the children of Israel into the Promised Land. And on a personal note, I think that when it comes to things like focus and drive and ambition, in some ways these are all wonderful things. Having somebody with focus and drive and knowing where they want to go is something that is incredibly valuable, and it's something that unfortunately I feel like a lot of people in my generation are missing. And women probably understand this better than anybody, because the last thing that you want is a man that has no drive, no focus, or no ambition. If he's just kind of like, cool with where he is now and doesn't really want to do anything else, that's probably going to be a guy that's not a great husband. And even though I think that this would be true in a woman as well, you definitely don't want a woman that lacks these qualities either. It's something that, especially for men, is incredibly important to us. To have goals to want to aspire to, whether it's, in the business world or in your personal life, these are things that tend to make you a better provider for your family. And again, not that that's not important in women as well, it's just emphasized more in men with our role in the family unit. But they can sometimes overshadow the more important things. In other words, we let our ambition drive us to, making decisions that we wouldn't normally make in order to get to where we think we need to be. Sometimes it may be where we actually need to be. Sometimes it may be something that we realize a little down the road it wasn't such a good idea to aspire to whatever it is that we're looking at. But either way, even if we have our ambition set on the right thing, it is very much possible for us to lose sight of the reason that we wanted to go there. And to sort of illustrate this, I wanted to go through this story because reading the whole Pentateuch and then looking back at where Israel started is sometimes something that is very helpful in gaining some perspective and context. Because if you look at the Exodus and the story of Moses bringing the children of Israel, bringing the new nation out of Egypt, why did he do that? Well, I think if you're looking at the Pentateuch and looking at how it ends and looking at everything that happened between there, you would say, oh, well, the goal is to get to the Promised Land. That's where they're heading the whole time. They leave Egypt so they can go to the Promised Land. No. And by the way, this is an answer that I would have given if I hadn't thought about it for a minute. I would have said, why did he bring them out of Egypt? So he could fulfill his promise and take them to the Promised Land. No, that wasn't it. Granted, that was part of it, but that wasn't the ultimate goal. And that ultimate goal is actually stated in Exodus 7, 15 and 16. Exodus 7, 15 and 16, where Moses writes, and this is, by the way, God talking to Moses and giving Moses his marching orders. Go to Pharaoh in the morning, as he is going out to the water, and station yourself to meet him on the bank of the Nile, and you shall take in your hand the staff that was turned into a serpent. You shall say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you, saying, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But behold, you have not listened until now. Now, this is a verse that is very telling and really interesting. The stated goal of taking the children of Israel out of Egypt is not to go to the Promised Land. God says right there that the reason he's bringing them out is so that they may serve him in the wilderness. Well, now the wilderness isn't the goal. That seems backwards compared to everything else that we've heard in not only the book of Exodus, but in the following books. We're supposed to be going to the promised land, the wilderness. That's not where we're going. But did you notice that the physical destination wasn't the goal anyway? The goal was to go out and to serve God. Now, if that's the goal, then everything else just makes sense. Because if the goal is to have his people serve him, does it really matter whether they're serving him in the wilderness or in the promised land? Now, the promised land was important to God, and it was important to the Hebrews. They had been promised that since the days of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That was something that went along with God's promises, but ultimately, that wasn't the goal, and it never was. The goal was for God's people to serve and worship him and to have that special relationship that he had always wanted to have with his children. That was what God wanted. And the children of Israel lost sight of that all the time. In fact, there were several times where they got so focused on being in the promised land and having the good life that they had been promised that they started ignoring the real purpose that Moses just stated, the real reason that they came out of the slavery in Egypt to begin with. You can look back, for example, at Moses, who himself forgot that for a little while. You remember when he struck the rock instead of speaking to it the way God told him to? See, that was a moment where for a moment Moses forgot what his real purpose was. His purpose was not to provide water to the children of Israel. His purpose was to obey God. And obeying God meant speaking to the rock so that they could have water provided to them. The goal was not Moses doing that. It was always up to God. You could look at the rebellion of Korah, where they're saying that we don't like the fact that Aaron and Moses are getting all this prestige, and so what we're going to do is we're going to take it upon ourselves to lead, and we're going to lead people into the promised land ahead of when God told them that they were going to, and with different leaders than God told them to. See, they forgot that their goal was not to get to the promised land. Their goal was to serve God and do what he asked them to do. Aaron, at the foot of Mount Sinai, when Moses is up there getting the Ten Commandments, what does he do? He builds them a golden calf in the wilderness. Instead of serving God the way that he was supposed to, what Aaron did was he just, as part of the journey, had an idol built, and they were worshiping that instead of worshiping God. You see, ultimately, you could look at every mishap that happens amongst the people where they disobeyed him and say it was because they forgot that their real purpose was supposed to be to serve God, not to get to the promised land. They were going to the promised land, and it was good that they were headed that way. But ultimately, it wasn't the reason that they were there in the first place. And it's funny because you can kind of see this play out in the books following the Pentateuch, Joshua, Judges, and then, of course, further on in Kings and Samuel, and a little bit further in the minor prophets and the major prophets. Why was Israel punished? Because even after they were in the promised land, their purpose was still to serve God. And they forgot that too after they were already in the promised land. See, the reason God wanted them to go to the promised land was because it was going to be easier for them to serve him there. That was the goal. Service was always the reason they were heading to where they were going. And I think in a lot of ways, that's really where Christians are, and sometimes we forget that. Sometimes I think that we as Christians forget that the reason that our goal is heaven, for example, is because ultimately we're supposed to be worshiping God in heaven. I mean, going to heaven's a great thing. And being in God's presence directly is probably going to greatly enhance our ability to worship and serve him. But the reason we're going there is because we ultimately want to serve him and have a relationship with him. The goal is not heaven itself. That's just the place where the goal is. And if we forget that, then we may do what the children of Israel did and think that the place is really the ultimate goal, not what we're going to do once we get there. Never let getting to a destination or getting to where you think you need to be blind you from remembering why you wanted to go there in the first place. Because when you do that, that can justify a whole lot of terrible things. That can justify sort of a ends justifies the means mentality. That can cause you to forget who you are and why you're going there, and can cause you to make some mistakes. If we remember that the reason that we're going to heaven is because we want to have communion with Him, we want to be with Him, and we want to serve Him, that's going to solve those problems. Never allow your desire, your ambition, your drive, your focus on the destination cause you to lose sight of the reason you wanted to go there in the first place. Stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided